My name's Stuart William Holmes. I'm not quite certain the answer to the next one, squadron, because I was on two squadrons on flying boats, and the rest of my time I wasn't on a squadron.
Okay.
I was on wings and stations and things.
What flying boat squadrons were you with?
I started off on 205 as a sergeant pilot, and then I came back to UK from Singapore, and to everybody's consternation I was sent back to Far East Flying Boat Wing as a newly commissioned pilot officer.
Was it 88 that you served with in Korea?
I started off in 205 Squadron as a sergeant pilot, and we went up to Korea,
Right, okay.
to Iwakuni.
Yeah.
And I did two short 1 month tours there, back to Singapore, back to UK to Oktu where I was commissioned, then back out to the wing, and then the wing commander said, all I can do is put you on one of the other squadrons. We've never had anybody come back we haven't had many commissioned. We haven't had anybody come back. And there's going to be this mix of flying with crews that you've flown with before and different ranks. He said, I'll put you on a different squadron. So I went on a different squadron, and I was told to go into the officers' mess and get accommodation, and then report to the squadron the following morning. Discovered that the crew that I was on had 9 of the NCOs with whom I'd flown as a sergeant pilot before I went back to UK some 12 weeks previously.
Okay, we'll get on to that.
Okay.
Look, first of all, Stuart, let's find out a bit about what was your life like before the war, before Korea, before we got into flying. Where are you from? Just tell me a little bit about your background.
Right, well, I was born in the West Riding of Yorkshire in 1931, working class family. Father had, I don't know what it was, he was something to do with the army, but he was actually a motor mechanic, a foreman motor mechanic. When war broke out in 39, or in fact 2 days before war broke out, he was called up to go to join the army. Now, I had never and I would have been 8 then, I had never ever seen him in a military uniform. I'd never been aware that he had gone to TA evening sessions anywhere or to a TA camp anywhere. I had no knowledge until the war broke out that he had anything to do with the army. But he went, and within 2 weeks he was in France. And I suppose the only thing I can think of was that because he was a trained motor mechanic, there was no point in trying to give him any continuation training because he was doing it every day of his life. And they sent him straight out to keep the vehicles running in France. He was taken ill while he was there, came back to UK, went to a series of military hospitals and was finally invalided out. And when I was 12, he died. And so Mum had to go out to work to support the two of us.
When you say he went out to France, was that for Normandy or for the British Expeditionary Force?
It would have been British Expeditionary Force, presumably, because this is 2 weeks into World War II. And they were dashing around France, living in barns and God knows what. But he came home, and whatever he'd been invalided out for gradually got worse and worse, and he spent a lot of time in the local civilian hospital until he died, as I say, just when I was just 12.
Okay, so moving on from that must have been difficult, and obviously your mum had to step up and do an awful lot of work. What was your schooling like?
Just standard elementary school. Left it at 15.
When you were being taught, do you ever remember hearing about this place called Korea?
Nope, never heard of it. And I didn't hear of it for some years afterwards either.
Okay, so look, just tell me a bit about how you you left school at 15
Yep.
with a basic education. You've obviously done extremely well. So just talk a bit about how you found your feet and how you
Well,
found yourself in the Air Force.
the schooling I said it was in elementary. It was I suppose it would have been now classed as a secondary school. And it had 3 streams in the 4 year of the course. One was commercial, where they taught, there was a boys' school, a day school. They taught the boys shorthand, typing, that sort of thing, clerical work. There was the industrial, which I went into, where they were taught engineering and machinery things, and there was another one which was to put the odds and sods in to fill it up. So when I left school, and I don't know how I did it, I got into being accepted as an apprentice with the David Brown gear manufacturing firm, which was in Huddersfield, my hometown. And I started off, because I was too young to go into the apprentice training school. You had to be 16, I think, to get into that. So I was given an odd job in the worm gear drawing office, which I found great fun, because there were little sections of 4, a section leader and a number 2 and a number 3, and then the boy, and I was the boy. And after a short while, I found myself being given a sheet of paper. Some firm had written in, and they said they wanted half a dozen reduction worm gears to reduce the speed from the electric motor or whatever it was to go to their machinery. And they wanted a reduction from one speed to another and a power transmission of whatever it was. And I was writing all these things down and doing the conversions and sending them off. And then I became old enough to go into the training school. And in the training school, well, we learnt to use all machinery, lathes, grinders, drills, boring machines, the lot. And then out onto the shop floor. And I got into the tool room. I do not know why. I got there, and I suddenly found I was working on tasks that had been sent down to some guy called Stuart Holmes, who didn't know what the hell he was talking about, because he was asking for unnecessary and impossible things. Well, yeah, because I'd never been told when I was doing that. I mean, simple things, when the 2 shafts changed from one diameter to another. And nobody said, oh, give it a standard 1/8 of an inch radius. And I was doing them nice tight corners and things, which meant that the men on the shop floor had to take a tool out of their lathe and put another in to be able to get a right angle thing, until somebody said, you don't need that, just use the ordinary one. And, anyway. But after a while, I wasn't happy there. And my last year at school, I joined the Air Training Corps. And I loved that. We used to go certainly once a month, very often every other weekend, off to an RVF station. We were surrounded by them within an hour and a half's coach drive. And in those days, you could do an awful lot of things. We went flying in all sorts of aeroplanes. All right, sitting in the rear turret of a Lancaster or something while it flew around in a cross country, or sitting in the mid-upper turret. I came down after one of the ones and said, did anybody tell you not to press the triggers? I said, no, but I didn't think it was a wise thing to do. Why? He said, well, they were cocked. If you had, you would have probably shot yourself down. So thanks for that. But I enjoyed my time. We went off to a week's camp once a year, and that was great fun. And I went off to a gliding course that the ATC ran, a very simple one, single seat, canvas and plywood type construction. And you didn't get much airborne time. You usually dragged along the ground on a cable, or got to a certain height. And if you're going too high, the chap who was managing the winch speed just reduced the speed, so you had to come down and land anyway. But we did get off. But the one thing I loved there was that another ATC cadet on the initial course that I was on came from my hometown as well. But he was an apprentice motor mechanic. We had something in common there. And he started helping repair the vehicles we used to drag the gliders from the hangars out on the airfield to take them back and recover them from where they landed. And I was helping him do that and learned quite a lot about it. But more than anything, I learned to drive. And we were driving these things around, totally unlicensed, until one weekend when the station commander of this RAF maintenance unit visited and asked our gliding school CO, these people, what sort of licenses are they using? I said, I don't think they have any actually. He said, well, they ought to have, driving around our RAF station. Give me a list of their names. So it was handed over. Next week we went there, or next time we went there, we were even given an RAF driving licence with our names on, technically allowing us to drive RAF vehicles anywhere, public roads, on the airfield, and I was only 16 at the time, so nobody said anything. And eventually, one weekend, one of the instructors who just left the Air Force as a pilot at the end of the rundown said, you know, the RAF are recruiting pilots, navigators and signallers. This was 1948. Anybody interested? So I said, oh yeah, sounds good to me. So I wandered along to the recruiting office, spoke to the recruiting sergeant, and he took a lot of details down, and he finally asked, might have thought he could have asked it a little earlier, how old are you? So I said, I forget what it was then, 17 and a bit. He said, we can't have you in until you're over 17 and a half. Come back when you're 17 and a half, lad. So I did, and I walked in. He said, I remember you. What's your name? I told him. He said, yeah, here's all the paperwork we had from the last one, so you don't have to do much more. And shortly afterwards, I was called down to RAF Hornchurch for an aircrew aptitude week. Accepted for pilot training, sent home, told to be ready to move at short notice. Got a call-up notice in the February of 1949. Joined Air Force and went around various courses. And suddenly somebody said, we're looking to make up a course to go to Southern Rhodesia for pilot training. Anybody interested? Up went my arm, and a few more did. So we had a week's leave, embarkation course, down to London, to Southampton, and then we boarded the RMV Stirling Castle, which was ploughing. You know that?
I've heard of this ship.
Yeah. Well, the Union Castle line ran a ship every week from Southampton to Cape Town and Cape Town to Southampton, two of them, and this changed over in sort of mid-Atlantic. And we were then shunted off from the rest of them, did a few more bits of training, and were issued with khaki drill, and onto the Stirling Castle, down to Cape Town, 3 days on the train. It was a 14 days sail, in glorious luxury. Everything was rationed in the UK. Nothing was rationed on that ship. There was food there that I'd never even heard of, let alone eaten. And we had I said, if this is the RAF, 14 days of this, I could stand it for 14 years. We got out of Cape Town, got on a train, 3 days up to Bulawayo, which was again interesting and exciting. And we started our flying training there. 18 months, got our wings, Battle of Britain Day 1950. Came home to UK, did a series of courses, and that's how I got onto Sunderland's, from the selection I'd made in the last few weeks in Rhodesia, FB for fighter bombers. And I got down 2 days late to Calshot, and was put under close arrest by the orderly sergeant because I was 2 days late.
Just to explain what FB actually stood for.
Well, I thought it was flying boats. It actually, well, I thought it was fighter bombers. The RAF had taken it to be flying boats, FB. And I got down to Calshot, placed under close arrest for being absent without leave for 2 days, blew my top, and as the orderly sergeant looked quite young and inexperienced, and I was 19, I said, I want to see the duty officer and I want to see him fast. And things moved in all directions, and a young flying officer came down. He said, duty officer's not around, I'm the orderly officer, what's the problem? So I told him. He said, well, why are you late? I said, because I got this bloody telegram sent by the RAF telling me to report here 2 days ago, and if you look at the telegram, it is dated yesterday. So I couldn't possibly do what I was doing. And he looked at this and a few phone calls. He said, sorry about that. Get yourself, find yourself a room in the sergeant's block, and you go down in the morning and join the rest of your course, which was 3 Sunderland crews going through a 4-month conversion training course at Calshot, where we got on the Sunderlands. We learned to taxi them around on the water.
Describe the training for me. What you did, how you got to grips with the Sunderland, because they're quite,
right.
Even on the water, they're not exactly super agile, are they?
No, they're not. Well, this was one of the interesting things. So we had 3 crews. Each crew was either 10 or 11 people, 2 pilots, 1 navigator at that time, 2 engineers, 2 gunners, and 3 signallers. I think that makes up 10. We all got out onto this flying boat on the water day 1 with a little bag of rolls and cheese and flasks of coffee, and we spent the whole day walking around the aeroplane, learning where everything was. I mean, the first thing was, how do you move it from where it is on the end of a bit of string on the water and move it around the water? And so we spent some time just learning how to moor and slip moorings, all the crew, because everybody had to be able to do it. And then we started the engines. And this is going on, I would say, over a total of 4 months, the whole course. Taxiing around Southampton water, remembering we were a ship and we had to obey the rules of the road for ships. And it's the old power gives way to sail and all that sort of stuff. We were never quite certain how the Queen Mary rated against the Sunderland, and it came to the disparity of power, but we avoided them. And we taxied around for a long time. The most difficult thing of the course was learning to moor the aeroplane, because there's a great big floating balloon in the water with a steel wire over the top, and the Sunderland, the front turret, retracted backwards until it came not quite under the pilot's feet, but fairly down there. And 2 chaps went into the space made available by retracting this, put a ladder over. One went down the ladder with a rope in his hand, and as the pilot steered the Sunderland past the rope through, the other one grabbed it and whipped it round the bollards. And if the pilot hadn't been going too fast and everything else went right, we were moored up. And then we let it go, and another crew member did it, and we changed the pilots over. And I think the navigators had a go as well. But it was tricky. The record held by one of the other crews on my course was 27 attempts to get on the buoy, missing it every time, going too fast, missing it, going too far. And then when we could do that reasonably, we started flying it.
And of course, Calshot was tidal, so you had a current to consider as well.
Oh yes, and a wind.
Yeah.
They weren't the easiest of things. After a while, you got accustomed to it, and you had to be fairly good, because even at Calshot, where we had 4 Sunderlands and moorings, so you had to avoid them. When we got out to Singapore, we had 15 Sunderlands on the trots there, one for each of the 3 squadrons. And taxiing around, you were in fairly close proximity to other Sunderlands which were helpless. But that was training, and we were flying day and night, and doing weapon training for the gunners and the signallers. Yes, they did weapons, because the 2 gunners usually manned the front and rear turret. The beam turrets were manned, if we went to war, by the off-duty signallers and an engineer, because we had at that time two forward-firing 303 machine guns in the turret, operated by the front gunner, and then either side of him, and in the hull of the aircraft, but above the waterline, obviously, there were 4 fixed 303 machine guns, which the pilot fired from a button on his control wheel. And that was great fun, with very accurate sighting arrangements of a little metal rod on the fuselage outside the aircraft, just in front of the pilot, and another one inside, which he could pull from the horizontal position and pull it up to a vertical, and that was the rear side. So when he went there and put them on the target and pressed the button, in theory he hit the target with the 303s. At the back there was a 4-gun turret, 303s, and halfway down the fuselage on either side there was a big opening, and in there was a 50 caliber or 0.5-inch machine gun. And if we were on patrol, the hatch lifted up, and the gunner stood in this open hatchway there with his cannon.
Did you have depth charge?
Yes.
Only in Korea?
Well, yeah, I mean, when we were in UK, it was a training. When we were, yes, all right, only in Korea. We didn't carry them around at Singapore unless we were going to do some practice target bombing.
How many would you have on board?
We carried 2 aside and had a reload of 4. They had a peculiar arrangement, and I don't think I've got a photograph. I may have one. You see something. Underneath the wing, there's a track, or a double track, and on it ran 2 trolleys. So you had 2 trolleys that side, 2 trolleys that side. Now, for practice work and for anti-personnel activity, you put 8 bombs loaded up, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And they could be controlled by either the pilot or the navigator, just pressing arrangements, and they could drop them all 16 at a time, or 1, 2, 3 as you wished. Now, if we were going seriously, they took those off and replaced. Each carrier had 1 depth charge on it, so there was 1, 2, 3, 4. And you could use a principle, you could drop all 4 at once, or any combination of those. And they did make a big splash when they hit the water and exploded. But rather great, rather fun.
Yeah, but when you let go of 16 or 4, whatever, whichever's the heaviest.
Well, the 16 were little ones, they were only 25-pounders.
Right, but 4 depth charge at one go.
Oh yes, because they were, I think they were 250-pound depth charges. So yes, there's £1,000 went at once, yeah.
Okay, and in terms of the flyability, I mean, how quickly did you adapt to flying them? Because you'd obviously trained on all sorts of other aircraft.
Well, I hadn't, you see. I trained on Tiger Moths and Harvards to get my wings, and then done the conversion course onto twin-engine aircraft, Wellingtons, and then onto the Sunderland. It was just a natural progression, in fact. Once you got used to the peculiarities of operating a flying boat, they were quite pleasant. They were slow, they were old, they were noisy, they were very cold in winter. But it was a different flight. One started off because, of course, there were no brakes. So you couldn't start going down the runway and keep yourself straight with a little touch of rudder if you're swinging. You had to control it by differential engine power. So you pushed a bit more on that or pulled back a little on that when you had all 4 engines running until you had a sufficient speed to be able to use the rudder pedals to turn the rudder to get directional stability from that. And then eventually you pulled off and took off. But the peculiar thing was, in the early stages, as I say, you couldn't control the aircraft's direction by wind and airspeed, because there wasn't any. So you had to do it on power. The aircraft actually, when it was on the water stationary, had one float in the water, or the other float in the water, and you had to get one of those out of the water to get the wings level before you started increasing speed on the takeoff run. You had to get it onto the step, which meant you had to lift the nose until it gradually, as your speed built up, it lifted out of the water, and instead of sitting down in the water, it was now halfway up the submerged part of the fuselage, and that allowed you to increase speed. You would never got airborne in that position. So, unlike any other airplane I've ever flown, you started off your takeoff run with full rudder in one direction, stick hard back to get the nose up, stick hard over to that side to get one float out of the water. What was the other peculiarity about it? But and four throttles opening them, but pulling one back to keep yourself straight by adjusting engine power. So you were taking off starting a takeoff run in that position, which was contrary to any other aeroplane I've ever heard of, let alone flown. But once you got it airborne, it flew like just a rather big, heavy aeroplane. Yeah. 60,000 pounds all that weight, and by present standards, nothing at all.
Okay, in your training, are there any hairy moments stand out? Any in a landing or a takeoff or near misses?
During training, yes, I managed to severely damage 2 aeroplanes. I had a very bad flying instructor. We started on the Tiger Moth, and he always taxied the aircraft from the dispersal to the end of the airfield to begin the takeoff run. It was grass airfield at that stage. And it was only when we were ready to go that he said, "You have control." So I then took over from slightly low speed taxiing in the takeoff direction, single throttle of course, and took it off that way. And as soon as we landed, he took over and taxied it in. So I never taxied the aircraft on my own. In the end, I got I know, he decided I wasn't doing very, very well, and he put me up to the wing commander for a scrub check. If failure thing. And the wing commander said, what's the problem? Why am I riding with you? I don't know, he just doesn't seem to get on with me. I mean, I haven't flown, I haven't actually landed the aeroplane, because I've been aware, as we got near the ground, his hand was controlling the stick and his feet were controlling the rudders, and if I took my hands off, it would have landed normally, because the instructor was doing it. He said, "Oh, all right. Well, I'll give you a change of instructor." And I taxied out for takeoff with a new instructor who was a splendid chap. And he said, there was a bit, you're not very good at taxiing, are you? I said, I've never taxied on my own before. Oh, so anyway, he took off and flew around. He said, yes, you're all right, taxi it back in, and got it back in. Next trip, off you go on your own. And that caused a problem because I had to get out of the dispersal where there were some Harvards and tiger moths and a bit of a crosswind. And as I started moving, I put on full rudder to turn. Nothing happened. Now, I knew, 2 days later I knew, that what I should have done was to increase engine power to get the propeller turning faster and faster to put more airflow over the rudder, which would have now reacted and turned me, but it didn't. And I'm getting close to those aeroplanes, and eventually I cut the engines. But by that time I'd hit a Harvard and with the tiger moth. This didn't go down well with them, and there was an inquiry, and I was told formally, "Don't worry about it. We've heard from some other cadets who've been interviewed what this guy was like, and." The instructor is on his way back to UK, and we've got a new one. And the new one, chalk and cheese. He was a splendid chap, ex-New Zealander, a very, very nice guy. But there was this. That was
embarrassing. Yeah,
that was embarrassing.
What I meant was on the Sunderland. Actually, do you have a moment on the Sunderland?
I never had a problem on the Sunderland.
Okay, that's fine.
Right.
So you were picking up the story.
It was sent out to, after all the course, in August of 1951, I think. I'll check it in a moment. Flew out to, at the bottom of that pile there's a thick red book. If you could pass me that, it would just help if we're going to ask for dates and things. Right, Calshot, May 51. That was an interesting thing, actually. Can I go back a little bit there, because you may find it of some interest.
Yeah.
I said they made up with crews, the vast range of experience. I had, my co-pilot was an ex-Battle of Britain fighter pilot who'd done other things, but he was now going on to heavier aeroplanes, Sunderlands, and but they trained the pilots to the same standard, which was effectively aircraft captain standard, and we did it turn and turn about. So one day I would be flying the aeroplane as a sergeant with a very, very experienced flight lieutenant in my co-pilot's position and doing what I asked him to do, and then we change over. I found that very, very, very strange. But right, 205 Squadron, September 1951, arrived at on Far East Flying Boat Wing, which was one of the 3 squadrons on the wing. Each squadron are having only 5 aircraft per squadron, so it's 15 aircraft for the wing.
That was into Singapore.
That was in Seletar, at Singapore.
And just, I mean, you know, you've said yourself, you're, from a working class background in West Riding.
Yep.
You had this incredible trip down to, South Africa, and you've done your flight training down in Rhodesia, which must have been pretty spectacular. And then you end up in Singapore. I mean, what would you remember of, what was Singapore like in 1951?
Singapore. I mean, I had nothing to judge it against, nor did I have anything to judge any of the ship or Cape Town or Bulawayo or anything. Each one was a novel experience, which was what I thought was absolutely marvellous. I was picking up new countries, new ways of life and everything. Singapore was a rather scruffy British colony. A lot of Chinese around, but a lot of slummish buildings. and most of the commerce was, well, I suppose pre-war British standards. There were no supermarkets or anything like that. There were little stalls. And in Singapore at that time, the RAF had 1, 2, 3 airfields, and there was a civil airfield at Kelang. The Seletar, which is where the flying boats were based, also had a squadron of Mosquitoes there and a few other light training aeroplanes and communications aeroplanes. Oh God, what was the other? There was one which was the bomber airfield, Tinker, which had an Australian Lincoln squadron there and occasionally an RAF Lincoln squadron in replacing it. And then there was one Changi, which was the transport one, where they had the communications wing there flying around the Far East, and where aircraft coming from UK or going back to UK took off or landed from for the 5 or 6 day quick flight back to UK.
Did you know? Did you know that when you went to Singapore, that the probability is you'd be going to Korea, or was it a totally different posting?
I must have been aware of it, because I do remember during my training in Rhodesia, we became aware of the outbreak of the Korean War. I don't think I've got a note of it, but it was July 50, June, July 50, and I was sort of halfway through my Harvard stage there. So we were aware that there was something happening out there, but I certainly wasn't dashing into battle with my sword up there ready to slash the... In fact, I don't think I realised when I said flying boats that they had flying boats out there, and if I hadn't realised that they were from Singapore going up to Japan and flying up there. It was only when I got out to Singapore and in a short space of time found myself flying up to Japan to get in my part of the Korean War, which was 1/3 of the war. I don't know whether you're aware of that.
Especially with you, but I mean, most people did 12-month tour out there.
Yeah, well, Flying Boat Wing in Singapore was a 3-year tour, 3 squadrons. The wing sent the best part of 1 squadron up to Japan for a month. 4 aircraft, occasionally 3, but normally 4 aircraft, did a month up there, and then they were replaced by aircraft from another squadron who did a month. They were replaced by the aircraft from the 3rd squadron, and then the whole thing. So it was a 3-monthly rotation for them. And that was, I suppose, really the first time I'd realised that there was a war going on. Here we are, 205 Squadron, September. Oh, we were doing also in Singapore, we were doing what we call patrol labels. We were going around the coast to see that the Chinese communists were not shipping bad guys ashore by day or by night or anything. We're doing occasional patrols around the coast, or fire dogs, which were great fun, because this is where we used the light bombs, the 25-pounders on the aircraft. We flew out to a patch of jungle, which gave the navigator a hell of a job, because one patch of jungle is like another patch, particularly when you're looking down at it. No roads, no railways, not many rivers. He was given an area, and I think it was 3 kilometres by 1 kilometre rectangle, and it moved sideways, and we were about 2 to 3 hours flying up and down here on one run, firing the guns into the jungle as we approached the start, stopping when it got to the end, turn round, and dropping the bombs down there, and then turn round and start it all over again, going in a sea. And the Chinese terrorists were supposed to be in that part of the jungle, and we were either shooting. I mean, we didn't see anything or anything, but we were just sort of bombing and machine gunning it. And then when we left, the army moved in from the sides and sort of swept through and picked up anything that we'd hit, like a tiger or something like that, but not many people, I don't think. So that was slightly unusual.
That sounds like quite a fun trip, quite a fun thing to do, and warmish, I suppose. And so, what do you remember of landing it? So, was your first base in Japan Iwakuni then?
Sorry?
Was your first base in Japan Iwakuni?
My only base in Japan was Iwakuni.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's move on to Iwakuni.
Okay.
And just tell me a bit about what it was like. Where, obviously we've heard a bit about Cowshot, Singapore, bigger squadron. Just the setup at Iwakuni and what it was like for you to live there.
Well, the first thing was Iwakuni, and our job in Iwakuni was extremely unusual. The base, I think I mentioned to you earlier, had been one that had been given to the RAF at the end of World War II. And the RAF had pulled out and the Australians had moved in, and they had built married quarters in around the camp. And this is relevant. When the Korean War started, they moved a lot of other aeroplanes to Iwakuni. And the flying RAF, the RAF were given 4 bungalows and I think 4 two-storey houses, and they were rationed out. The two-storey houses went to the NCOs because there were more of them. Bungalows were for the officers. So each crew had one house and one bungalow, which had been civilian married quarters, and with a Japanese maid in each house to do the cleaning and the washing and everything. And we lived and ate in the Australian Air Force sergeant's mess or officer's mess, depending on your condition, which was a short distance away, but it was quite pleasant. That was slightly unusual because we were living with Australians. I'd heard of them, but I didn't know much about them. And they, in my first tour, when I was in the Australian sergeant's mess for food, I got to breakfast one morning and a bunch of American Navy non-commissioned ranks and a lot of Australian Army non-commissioned ranks and 2 or 3 British non-commissioned ranks there. And I noticed, because I was young and very inexperienced and wet behind the ears, that all the Americans were drinking tea and all the Australians were drinking coffee. And I watched this for 2 or 3 days and I thought, I can't stand this anymore. And I said, I cannot understand it. As far as I've known all my life, Americans drank coffee by the gallon and the Australians couldn't live without a gallon of tea every hour. But you chaps are doing it the other way around. Why? And one of the Americans said, you don't call that crap coffee, do you? And the Australians said, you don't call that bloody crap tea. So they decided to drink the other's national drink as being preferable to a version of their own. But it was quite a large station. As I say, they had, by the time we got there, the United States Navy had 3 squadrons of maritime patrol aircraft based there. Sometimes flying boats, sometimes wheeled aircraft, but they were all of the same wing. Now, the other thing that was peculiar when the Americans graciously and I think with great gratitude accepted the British offer of one squadron of patrol aircraft. Said, we've got a problem. You are in an air force. We don't have flying boats in our air forces. If you fly a flying boat in American service, you're in the Navy. So from that moment we became part of Fleet Air Wing 6, Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Fleet, Hawaii, US Navy. And we were a US Navy operational unit all the time, all the squadrons we went up, under operational control from the US Navy. And with no, apart from our own commanding officers, no British interference with our operation at all. That was considerably unusual. And it was quite interesting too, because we occasionally, you usually briefed ashore the day before a mission, but sometimes we would go out to the US Navy's support ship in the bay and have our briefing out there. So we were, I won't say living on a US Navy ship, but we were eating and occasionally slept overnight on it. Living in an Australian Army mess during the day. It was a queer mixture. But everybody got on incredibly well together. The Americans have a slightly different attitude to discipline to the British. And of course the RAF have a different idea of discipline to the British Army too. Somebody once told me that in the Army an order is an order, in the Air Force it's an invitation to a discussion group. And it worked a wee bit that way too, I must say.
What work were you doing?
Well, there were three different tasks, and it depended on, I suppose it was the Americans who picked whoever, whether one of their squadrons or ours did it. One was the Tsushima Straits surveillance flight, and I don't know whether you're familiar with the geography. Well, you've got the Korean peninsula jutting down from the main Chinese mainland, and then a little over to the east there are the islands of Japan going up to the northeast. Now Korea has a very big coastline, and this is why the Americans were asking for maritime assistance, because they couldn't cover it with the aircraft they had available that they could spare. And so if we did that, and what happened, we flew from Iwakuni out of the Japanese air defense interception zone into the Korean interception zone, which is halfway down the strait, which were the Tsushima Straits. Tsushima being a narrow strip of islands between Japan and Korea. We flew there, and then we would just do a series of, normally we would have called them creeping line aheads, patrol about 3-4 miles separated from the previous leg. You'd come down, turn, go back up, turn, go back down, and moving always to the west for
away from shore.
Pardon?
Away from the shore.
Away from the yeah. Well, it was between the Korean peninsula and the Japanese islands here, and we were going up and down there. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So you'd be going up and down, towards and away, towards and away, towards and away.
Towards and away to it, and the idea was to see if there were, first of all, any, in the words of a rather rude and much better forgotten song that we used to sing, something. We were looking for subs and ships of Russian states. We never saw any, but there was always a fear that there were the Koreans would get, or I mean, they were getting assistance from the Chinese and from the Russians. There was always the fear that they would put some warships into that strait because it was the only route for supply into Japan from the rest of the free world. They came, from Japan into Korea. Most stuff came into Japan to the various airfields, American, British, Canadian, and then transshipped over to Japan, troop ships, supplies and everything. So it was a fairly busy stretch of water, rather, if you want to imagine Dover around there and Calais down there, it was similar, it was probably slightly wider. But we were looking out for anything like that, and we never did see any. That was the one, that was the Toshima, and it was the more normal one for us. Then there were the weather wreckies, which varied slightly, but the thing was, remember of course that we're at war with China, or at least China is helping the North Koreans against the South Koreans, and being rather clever chaps, the Chinese stopped all meteorological information being broadcast from China. So in the ships on the west coast of Korea and the ships on the east coast of Korea and the troops and aircraft and on the peninsula of Korea in the middle were bereft of any impending weather because it was tending to come from the west. So they sent out daily, and sometimes more than daily, a weather recce that flew various patterns around between the western side of the Korean coast, round, this is China up here, fly there, back down and go up again, and take weather readings as it went round. It was usually done at night, occasionally during the day, and it did vary whether, and occasionally it was done up on the east coast. Break for explanation, the United States Navy operated on the east coast of Korea, Task Force 77. The Commonwealth Navy operated on the west coast of Korea, and this was Task Group 77.1, I think. I forget now, time's flown. But that was, the Commonwealth Task Force was made up of mainly British and Australian, but occasionally Canadian vessels doing sea searches for anything, and they wanted the weather. In the middle there was the United States Air Force, Royal Australian Air Force, South African Air Force, and they wanted Met information as much as they could get, so they were getting it fed in from the weather wreckies.
So when you were sort of incorporated into the American, were you on the east? Were you operating with Task Force USA, or were you just, they were overseeing everything, and so ultimately you were just working the Commonwealth West side? No,
we were for weather. We tended to work the Commonwealth side, but in fairness, I have to say that if we weren't doing that the Americans would be doing it as well, because both American and Commonwealth troops and units wanted the same weather, so it didn't matter who it came from. Somebody went out, got it, transmitted it back to the Met, and you put out. Yes, no, I think that was fairly evenly distributed, but basically we didn't put much support flying activity around the American Task Force 77 because they had a lot of their own aeroplanes, and of course they had one or two or more carriers with them in the task force, so they would be looking after them themselves. The only time we did anything with them was when they were either doing an underway replenishment, which when they were having to steam fairly close together ships to pass fuel and supplies from one ship to another, and made them rather vulnerable to attack. Never happened. but we always, they would ask occasionally for 1 or 2 aircraft to fly a patrol around their task force and sort of give them some protection. It'd probably be an American aircraft going around behind us or above us or opposite directions or something.
Okay, and the third one?
The third one was actually a variation of the Metreki. There were, I think there were 3 we are going back a long time. Just a second. After the armistice, so I just opened it, but I've got 4 flights here over 6 days. ASP Tsushima, Surveillance Patrol Tsushima, Air Service Surveillance Patrol Task Force 77, ASP Tsushima, and then Fox Green, and Fox Green was a weather recce. So, and there were Fox Reds and things, and it was just whoever was planning the flying, and it would be, I don't know, some headquarters somewhere, whether it was a combined headquarters in Japan or whether it was control from Hawaii, I'm not absolutely certain. But I've got here a Met Recce 95. No, that's a West Coast 95.1. Tsushima, Fox Red. And they were 9, 10, 11-hour patrols.
You did say that they were cold. I mean, that first stint when you were with 205, are there any standouts on that particular month of flights that you did? Do you ever get to see, how close, did you ever fly over Korea?
Not often. Occasionally, if we finished a weather recce on the west coast, to get back home quickly, instead of going around the bottom, we'd fly across thing. Because, I mean, there was no enemy air activity in the bit we were at. And it was just a cut an 11-hour trip down to 9.5 or something. I don't recall flying over Korea in daylight. Only the island Jeju-do and the bottom southwest corner, which is now a great holiday resort, I understand. But in those days, it was a big prisoner of war camp for Chinese and North Korean troops who had been captured.
Did you ever feel vulnerable over there?
No, I think we were young and stupid. On the night, as I said, the weather recce tended to be at night, and they flew fairly close to the Chinese coast, coming southbound. You went north up the west coast of Korea, turned, and then came down on the east coast of China. And we were not very far offshore, 15 miles perhaps. And occasionally the radar chap said there's something following us. And that made one twitch just a little bit. But we were never attacked at all. As I say, we were young and sufficiently stupid to think that nobody would dare attack the great British Empire.
Did you ever have journalists on board?
Once, in my experience, I mean, there were 15 aircraft doing the thing, so there wouldn't be many. It wasn't a normal thing to have a journalist with us. There were 1 or 2.
But you flew with one?
We flew with one. I don't know who he was or what he was doing. He just came on board, and he was showing me what was going on in the aeroplane, and help yourself.
Did you were going off and doing these weather checks and stuff. Did you have any problems with the weather?
Yes. well, we lost an aeroplane due to weather towards the end of our tour and our squadron. Typhoons and that sort of stuff, mainly because they hadn't been picked up sufficiently far in advance from inland China. They're coming up that way, and we weren't getting the information occasionally. And nearest I got to it on aircraft I was flying, I think twice we got it. We prepared to evacuate to Guam, because there's a typhoon coming in scheduled to hit the southwest corner of Japan, and in neither case did it materialise. But flying transit, to get from Singapore to Japan, for us it was a 2-day trip. Flew to Hong Kong or Sangley Point in the Philippines, and then up to Iwakuni. And you could get some pretty nasty weather there at certain times of the year. High winds, heavy rain, and of course the change of temperature. In summer it was hot and sticky, and in winter it was cold, and it was dry mainly. It was still unpleasant.
Did you have searchlights?
Hmm?
Did you have searchlights?
No. Oh, well, what do you mean on our aircraft?
Yeah, like lamp light.
Well, we had landing lights.
Landers light, is it? The Landers light, a very, very powerful one. That you
Oh, no. No, what we did have what we call landing lights. They were just to illuminate where the sea was before you hit it. And in fact, we didn't often use those. We tended to use the World War II technique for landing a flying boat in the dark, and that was to decide where you were going to go, and perhaps you had a few dinghies, 4 or 5, with a fluorescent light on each one, marking off a flare path, and you position the aircraft, aim to go down the flare path, and when you got down to 300 feet, you brought the aircraft back to 85 knots, which was not far above stalling speed, and reduced the rate of descent, or set up the rate of descent about 200 feet a minute, and you just flew down in that plane until you hit the water, and then you close the throttles and you were down.
Nice. What about ENSA? Did you ever go off and see any ENSA shows? Any fun things you can remember?
No, I didn't see any. They tended, if they went through Iwakuni, they would go out to Korea to entertain the troops there. We did have one, I think we went to one American show that was on, just, an open house to go along there. But, the evenings, if they weren't flying, were spent in the bar drinking.
A lot of drinking back then, wasn't there?
Hmm?
There was a lot of drinking back then.
Oh yes, oh yes.
Are there any standout flights from your time around Korea?
Any?
Standout flights, any that really sort of, either rattled you or you remember?
Not yeah, one. And it was coming back in from I think it was it must have been a Toshima, coming back into Japan. And we transmitted as we crossed the ADs, Air Defence Interception Zone. As we crossed the ADs, we transmitted our call sign and position, and we didn't get a reply, and we still weren't getting replies. Now, we weren't certain whether our radio equipment, which was pretty crummy, was working properly, or whether something else had happened. And it continued back in, and the next thing we saw was a couple of American jet fighters circling us, and we could hear them, but they couldn't hear us. That's the problem. We heard one of them calling base and saying, "Yeah, we got him. It's big, white, 4-engined. By God, it flies, and it's got French markings on the side." which rather upset us.
Yeah.
But the next thing would have been, I suppose, if they weren't convinced it was us, they might have started firing, thinking it was somebody was going to attack Japan. Why they should, I don't know, because no non-United Nations force had ever got near Japan.
Had you ever landed in Busan or anywhere like that? Have you ever actually touched down in Korea?
I never landed in Korea at all. A slight aside here, when I joined the Korean veterans, I found that the Korean government very generously provided this revisit thing. You've heard about it, have you? Yeah. And we got once a year. Anybody want to go on a revisit? And somebody said to me, "Have you been on it?" And I said, "No." I said, "Well, I can't." "Why can't you?" I said, "Well, how can I revisit somewhere I have never visited? I've never put my foot on Korean soil, so how can I revisit it? I think it's a bit cheeky to go back where all the soldiers were dying and freezing to death on the ground and being shot at and everything, and living in tent, and we were living in comfort. And to go back to say I'm revisiting. In the end, somebody persuaded me, and Brenda and I went back for a week, and we had a marvellous time. I must say, I was very impressed with Korea and the generosity of the Koreans.
I was going to ask you about that. I was going to ask you if you'd been. Just wondering if there's anything else I need to ask you. I mean, I can't think of anything. Did you do the Incheon landings?
Any?
Did you escort on the Incheon landings?
No.
Was the crew the same setup at Kaohsiung as it was in Korea? The crew that you had in Korea was the same configured crew as you had in...
Same configuration, but not necessarily the same individuals.
Yeah.
I think, shortly after I got out to 205 Squadron, in fact, I think while I was back in UK at OC2, the RAF increased the crew size by one navigator, because although I say there were 2 pilots, 2 gunners, 2 engineers, 2 signallers, 3 signallers, there was only one navigator. And it was a pretty tough old task for him to do 9, 10, 11 hours in the dark, navigating all the time. So they gave them an extra one. They took a course graduating from Thorney Island, the navigator school, and instead of putting them through the conversion units, they sent them straight out to Singapore to join the wing out there, and kept an eye on them there. We did have a radar on board, but it was for anti-surface vessels, ASV Mark 7. We used it basically for navigation aids, picking up an island before we hit it and things like that. Or picking up a contact as we were on patrol. And we'd, one interesting thing, we were on patrol one day. I don't think I recorded it in my logbook at the time. In the Tsushima, and the radar man said, "I've got a contact, 20 degrees port, so and so. It looks pretty big." "Oh, let's go and have a look at it." So he turned and went off towards it. He said, "We're getting close." He said, "It is big. I don't think I've ever seen a contact as big as this." Because I mean, normally what they'd been was small fishing vessels and things. And we were down to about 300 feet, low cloud and raining, and visibility was pretty crummy. And suddenly in front, there was a large grey steel wall appeared. And I pulled round rather smartly and pulled away from it. And as I pulled away, we saw this bloody great battleship there. It was a cruiser actually. And the signaller, who was in the Astrodome at the time, said, "That's HMS Belfast." I said, "Come on." We saw it for about 10 seconds. He said, "Yes, but the Belfast is the only cruiser in the world that has a stack between its two masts, funnel between the two masts. I said, oh, come on. And we pulled out, we all carried a copy of Jane's Fighting Ships with us on that. And we looked at it, and sure enough, he was absolutely right. And I discovered afterwards his family were Navy anyway. So I pulled round again and approached leisurely and slowly from the starboard. And as we got ready, told a signal or two on his little oldest lamp, flashed the challenge of the day, which was a two letter combination, changed daily. And we expected to get back a 2-letter combination as the answer, not the same one, a different one, but we were waiting for it. And we flashed, I don't know what we call Echo Golf or something, as a short pause, and then a did-it, da-da, did-it, and a long thing. And what the hell's that? He said, he just said HMS Belfast. Said, yeah, we knew that. And then I heard the radios in the aircraft, they were pretty old and ancient, tremendous amount of interference break through when he was flashing that. You could hear it in your earphones at every other position. And there was a fairly long click from him. I said, what the hell are you sending? He said, I've just sent back, tut tut, secrecy. And we watched, and the answer came back, BALLS. So we came to the conclusion it was a British ship, a Royal Navy ship too. I don't think anybody else would have dared do that.
Good. Did you ever use any of your guns or your?
Not in, apart from on the
jungle stuff.
Yeah, on the jungle ones, or training things. Never fired in anger.
Okay, when did you come out then?
Come
out
of what? Out of the Air Force?
Out of Korea.
Oh, I left to come home in October '54.
Okay, so you were there during the peacekeeping.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I don't know. You look down at some of the entries here. You notice that some of them had a red line underneath. That was what we called an offensive mission. But at that stage, ASP Tashima dotted one, and that was after the ceasefire, armistice had been fired. So although they were still counted as semi-operational missions, we didn't expect to get shot at. People didn't trust the other side too much.
No. And when did you get into the sort of Korean War veterans then? How long did it take to find them?
Quite a long time, actually. And I'm not quite certain how. I must have been talking to somebody who mentioned them. And there was a South London branch of the Korean veterans at Croydon. And I wrote to them and said, can I join? And I paid my sub. But I thought of driving that distance on a Sunday morning and turning around for after an hour or so and coming back. So I never actually attended it there. And then it was decided to open the branch. Alan and I and some others are still in, although there is no such thing as a Korean War Veterans branch now, at Virginia Water, where it still is. And I joined it there in its fairly early days of formation. And I've been in it ever since, God knows how long now, quite a long time.
How did you feel about your experience of doing what you did as a pilot in Iwakuni in the Korean War? What's your sort of reflection on it now?
Well, I suppose strategically it had some value as far as the higher-ups were concerned, that there was a form of surveillance and protection around the coast. I don't think it actually... Had it been a hot war, it might have served some useful purpose. The fact that it was a Cold War, well, So was the whole of the RAF in Germany at that time. It could have turned hot overnight. I don't know whether we would have served any really useful purpose because our equipment was awfully primitive by those. I mean, the Sunderland came into service in 1936, and although they'd been modernised a little in and the way through by 54, 56, they were getting very. And remember the development that was going on in aviation at that time and electronics, yeah, and we were not advancing at all.
I think that's all. I think that's...
All right.
Yeah?
Yep.
Anything else you can remember? Any other stories you want to just tell me about before I shut down and go? Anything that stands to mind that you think, oh, I should tell him that?
Not particularly. I mean, it's like my whole RAF career. As one of my sarcastic friends once said when I was retiring, he said, and you're bidding farewell to your, what the hell was it he said? Unrewarded and undistinguished career. That's quite true.
Right, thank you very much.
All right.
Very, very interesting. Thank you, Stuart. Let me just take a photo of you.